Good morning, and thank you for coming. We are really honored that you created time to come here. Most of the things we did last minute, according to the UK experience. 1 month is already very short notice, but we are really pleased that you created time to come. This is a dissemination seminar, and it will be helpful to tell you a little bit about the project, which is the basis of this meeting. Chloe and I, who is Chloe? Met in the Washington, D.C. for another seminar, and during tea break, Chloe told me there is an announcement, there is a call for protocols, come and we write something about transnational military wives. And all I did was to tell her a story about transnational military wives in my country. And I was telling her the story. She was typing. By the end of 30 minutes, we had composed a protocol to submit to XCEPT. And we have representatives from XCEPT here. We will introduce them shortly. Thank you, XCEPT, for supporting this meeting. We are really grateful. So who are transnational military wives? I will delve into this thing later in the session, but these are women who are in different countries. But the way they come to those countries is that, for instance, Uganda deploys in Democratic Republic of Congo, and it plans to stay there for only 3 weeks, but the conflict becomes protracted, unexpectedly long. Instead of 3 weeks in 2000, Uganda repatriated in 2001, and 2003. So 3 weeks to 3 years, so much happened. Even the military formed families in the DRC. And statistics are difficult to find, but what we have now is that about 400 women came back together with our Uganda People's Defense Forces, and they are within the country as refugees, as citizens, sometimes as both, as both refugee and citizens in one place. We will discuss this. And this is what we call the spillovers, or I call spillovers of war. And so when the conflict stops, the war stops, we have spillovers, and Uganda is dealing with this as a spillover. This is not a new trajectory. Even in the Second World War, up to this day, we are still talking about spillovers or legacies of war. And how to deal with these things. We'll be asking you to tell us your experiences. And this is the basis of your invite. We've read some of your work, and we are really looking forward to listening to what you have discussed about legacies of war, spillovers of war. Thank you, and thank you for coming. Yes, things are changing quickly. I take this honor to, first of all, thank Pembroke for hosting us and for allowing us to have this meeting here. We are really grateful. In that regard, we have one of the key persons in this institution, and we would like to invite her to tell us something about this nice institution, and also to give us, she has also done she has published many articles in this area about conflict and gender and global conflicts. So let's invite Annette, please. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Annette Idler. I'm the director of the Global Security Program, which is based here at Pembroke College. And we've been really happy to have hosted the project, not just this seminar, this workshop today, but also the longer project that Grace and Chloe have been leading on the transnational military wives. Global Security Program, as mentioned, is here based at Pembroke College. Of course, we have a beautiful morning today with sunshine, hopefully just for this workshop today. You might have noticed Pembroke College is one of the younger colleges in Oxford. It was founded in 1624. So for Oxford standards, it's younger. We, as the Global Security Program, we've been here since 2021, when I founded the Global Security Program. And the idea was always to have basically workshops and research like this one. So under the umbrella of the Global Security Program, we work on evolving security dynamics in the contemporary world. We look at, for example, armed conflict in relation to the illicit economy, the global illicit economy, illicit flows. We focus particularly also on cross-border violence, cross-border conflicts, where there's a very natural fit with XCEPT as well, which is fantastic. We look at responses to insecurity and think about how we can transform also instances of war into peace. We have several projects. This is one of them, and it's amazing to have this one as part of the Global Security Program. We have another important one, which is ConPeace, from conflict actors to architects of peace. This is where we work on transitions from war to peace, especially in Colombia, in neighboring regions, also trying to understand what happens in those transitions, especially if we think about different types of violence. Of course, even once you sign a peace agreement, it doesn't mean that violence just ends, and it also means that there are many other violent groups that still continue to be active. We also have a project that is hosted at Blavatnik School of Government, but it's also part intellectually of our work here, which is the Minerva Global Security Program that focuses on contested cross-border spaces, illicit flows and order in the contemporary world. And there we look at different cross-border spaces ranging from the Horn of Africa over Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Golden Triangle, the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, and also Colombia, and a few others, where we're trying to understand what is it that turns such areas into trafficking hubs, and how does it then impact on global security more broadly. So we have several different research streams, but all of them are, I guess, in a way coherent in that they try and unpack what it really means to understand different aspects of global security, usually both from the bottom up, but also understanding the bigger context, and that are also all methodologically very diverse, drawing on qualitative work, on quantitative work, and also interdisciplinary to use different angles. We have also a visiting fellowship scheme that I just wanted to mention, where we bring together practitioners with academics to kind of bridge that policy research gap that often exists. And it's fantastic to have those conversations, to really be able to draw on the one side on theory, but on the other side also on these in-depth insights that practitioners have. And if you're interested in that, we also have flyers over there. Most importantly now, I would like to thank all of those who were behind organizing this event and also the larger research. So thank you so much to Chloe for bringing us all together, for making this happen. It's fantastic to have your work behind this. Thank you so much, Grace, also likewise for bringing us all together, for the fantastic work, and for coming all the way from your country to us and join us here. Thanks so much, Miguel, my colleague at the Global Security Program, our coordinator, who did all the work behind the scenes to make this happen today, and not just today, throughout the project. Thank you so much for all your work. And of course, thanks so much to the entire XCEPT team for your generous support, for helping us, bringing us all together, for doing this also in such a short notice, and helping with everything in the context of this project. And then, of course, thank you everyone here in the audience. And I know it's not just the audience, it's actually participants. I mean, I'm looking forward to hearing more about what everyone else has to say, both in the room, but also online. We have people joining us online today. And yeah, I wish us all a very exciting, intellectually stimulating day with lots of insightful panels and discussions. And I know some of the topics are rather heavy, which I think just is part of what we are talking about. but unpacking that and talking about it, and also trying to identify where are the kind of the entry points to find hope, to see what are actually the positive aspects, what are the things that can help us contribute to move away from violence and think about peace. I think that will obviously also be an important part of the day. So thank you so much for joining us. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Grace and Annette, for kicking us off already. We'll have Aliyah from the XCEPT team come to say a few words about XCEPT, and then I'll say just a couple of words, and then we will turn over to Melissa. Thank you, Aliyah.
Thank you, Chloe. I heard a couple of times people saying thanks, XCEPT, but actually all the real work that went into today's event is thanks to Chloe, Miguel, and Grace. So thank you, and thanks for everyone as well to be here. Just as part of introducing the XCEPT project, I'd like to start by introducing the rationale or theory behind the project. It's a simple but important one. While many of today's conflicts are fought within state borders, they're not constrained by them. The drivers and consequences of conflicts stretch across regions, across borders, and their impacts are felt across communities. They're also deeply gendered, which is what we're hoping to discuss today. So this is where XCEPT comes in. XCEPT, or the Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends Program, was designed to try to make sense of these complexities. As one of the UK government FCDO's flagship conflict research initiative, we focus on examining how conflicts connect across borders, how they implicate both civilian actors and conflict actors, and how formal and informal networks sustain them. A key area of focus for us is how women and girls interact with these cross-border conflict systems, both as actors within them, as well as those that are the most affected by them. Today's event is, and a lot of the research that will be presented is funded through what we call the XCEPT Research Fund, which is a grant commissioning platform that is designed to respond exactly to these questions. And we're very excited to hear the conversation and kind of contribute today more than ever to the discussion of putting gender as central to how conflict responses are organized. So thank you, and look forward to it.
Thank you so much, Aliyah, and I appreciate your generous thanks, but seriously, a huge thanks to XCEPT for making this possible. You heard a bit about the start of the project with Grace, from Grace, and how this began. The reason behind this workshop is that XCEPT very generously allowed us to repurpose some funds that were intended for me to do fieldwork in Congo, which I wasn't able to do for a whole host of reasons and certainly can't do, or couldn't do at the moment. And so we have DRC in mind very closely at the moment, as well as far too many other places and countries in the world that are just facing, escalating and extraordinary violence. We're so lucky to have some sunshine today. For anyone who was around in Oxford yesterday morning, it was very different. And so waking up and having the light felt great. I'm reading a book called Let the Light Pour In, which is a book of poetry by a wonderful Ethiopian poet who some of you may have come across, Lemsesi, that's around this idea of light always breaking, dawn always breaking the darkness of the night, which feels like a really important message to keep hold of during these pretty dark times. I wish we could let the light pour in to this room, which segues into a quick essential note around the fact that you may have noticed some equipment around and some wonderful characters who are behind this equipment. We wrote to the panelists, XCEPT would like to record the sessions and take some photos. Please do let us know if you're not comfortable with that, and we can have a conversation around it, but hopefully that feels okay to everyone. The idea behind that is that XCEPT and others, hopefully GSP, Global Security Programme 2, and all of you would want to, again, maximize the reach of these important conversations by putting some of these videos and materials online. So do let us know if, for whatever reason, that's not comfortable. Other essentials while I'm on it, fire exit through the main door, but hopefully we won't come to that. Loos, there's one here, and then there are a couple through the archway. So good to know that. To the substance, a couple more words. So I was looking back through the gazillion emails that have been sent about this, so thank you everyone for bearing with that. As you know, this kind of got pulled together, as Grace mentioned, and as you all know, within the month. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to everyone who has care responsibilities and to your families and partners who are stepping in to make this possible. We really appreciate that. We know how difficult it can be to mobilize and come. So I just want to extend that thank you to you all and to your wider networks to make that possible. Our first conversations around the workshop, the first email started around January 9th. The world felt like a very different place then already than it does now. As you know, the title of the workshop, the concepts bringing, around which our conversations will center our gender, global security, and cross-border conflict contexts. While borders have been contested for a long time, cross-border conflicts have been a feature of world history forever. It feels like at this particular moment, this idea of cross-border conflicts are again accentuated. Borders are being willfully ignored and potentially redefined. So really curious to sort of see how this will feature into some of our conversations today. And similarly, the concept of gender. For the last 15 or so years that I've been working very closely with this concept, I've seen it be expanded, contracted, politicized, diffused through institutional mechanisms and architectures. I've seen it be repoliticized, and we're now seeing it be scrubbed. And that feels really important to also mention that these two major themes around which we're coming together today are probably more contested than I've certainly ever seen them be, which makes it quite a challenging time, I have to say, to be sort of thinking about some of these concepts. So I also want to extend kind of a faraway kind of raise a glass that we'll do later to our colleagues who couldn't make it. Direct quotes I've had, I'm very excited to come to, once I sent the program, I'm sorry, gender's in the title, I can't come. We've just spent the last week removing all references to gender from our work. So this is real. We know of programs globally struggling for funding now, whose core mandates center around responding to supporting survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, also removing all of that work from their websites in the hope that that might save them from losing some funds. So we're in a really, interesting and challenging time for all of this, which also just adds to my gratitude to you all for coming. I can't wait for the magic that will kind of come together as people come, kind of are in the room. You are my sources of hope. I think this is, let's let the light pour in, but also be that light, I guess. And I've heard lots of really positive views. And Sarah, thank you for coming from so far. Annie, thank you for coming from so far. And Grace, thank you. And saying that this feels like a breath of fresh air in the midst of everything going on. So just a huge thank you. And with my notes, I don't think I've forgotten anything, but please do let me know if I've forgotten anything key. Thank you, of course, Annette. Sorry for also hosting us here and for hosting the project. I should have led with that. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you allowing us to use this beautiful space in Pembroke to make this happen. So thank you, everyone. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Melissa for panel one. Oh, and thank you, everyone online. Sorry, thank you for joining us online. I did want to say that. Okay, Melissa, over to you. Thank you, everyone.
Well, it's great. It's great to be here. I'm Melissa Parker. I'm an anthropologist at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and chairing this first session. I think we have 5 papers, the last of which will be delivered online. So the first 4 are thankfully in person, which is great. I've been asked to be very strict on timing, which is not something that comes naturally to me, but I shall try my best to restrict everyone to 10, 12 minutes. So without further ado, Grace. We're going to start with Grace, who's going to talk. The title of her talk is Survivors, Collaborators, Peacemakers, ? Cross-border military wives in the Ugandan borderlands. Grace, the floor is yours. I've just realised I assume everyone knows you, and they probably don't. So Grace is both a very dear friend and a collaborator, and I've worked with her for many, many years, decades, on multiple topics in Uganda's borderlands. She's also a medical anthropologist at Gulu University in northern Uganda, and a wonderful friend and scholar. Thank you, Grace.
Allow me to read a paper, because as an anthropologist, storytelling is our trade, and if you allow me to tell stories, I can do it the whole day. So to control myself. I always give myself a paper to read, and then we can tell stories later. Yeah. Survivors, collaborators, peacemakers, cross-border military wives in Uganda's borderlands. To understand this topic better, I will refer to the concept leftovers of war or the legacy of war, whereby leftovers of war mean things that we have to deal with. They were not expected, but they are present in our daily lives. They are present in the country. They are present in the individuals' and families' lives. And this is what the transnational military wives do in our lives in Uganda. As I told you earlier, Uganda is a landlocked country in East and Central Africa. The region has experienced wars during, several wars. For example, the war in northern Uganda, which lasted from 1986 to 2007. We also know the war which happened in Rwanda, which led to the genocide of over 800,000 Tutsis. We can recall that South Sudan is still experiencing all forms of violence, and also Sudan is currently experiencing a war. And for this conflict, Uganda serves as a host country. Sometimes our guests come in millions in a single day. They are war-affected people fleeing insurgency in their countries. In Uganda, if you are lucky to survive the war itself, we have a policy of giving you land, about 1 acre, so you can start a life. You start a life like most Ugandans would do, through farming. You let your children to attend the nearest schools, and you receive care in the hospitals like all Ugandans do. I must say, sometimes we are trying to share the little we have, and the little cannot satisfy all the refugees. In 2000 to 2003, Uganda, being aware of the increasing problem of refugees, planned a 3-week Operation DRC. That's a neighbor in the east. It aimed to annihilate all armed groups, particularly in Goma, Ituri, and the Uganda DRC borderlands. But the war became protracted, and due to the limited resources and too many casualties, Uganda repatriated its soldiers. Notably, from 2001, we Ugandans could see trucks, gunships, and foot soldiers returning from deployment in DRC. Unlike the previous deployments and even current deployments, since 2000, Uganda, instead of repatriating 1 man, 1 gun, Uganda repatriates 1 man, 1 gun, and their families. It is estimated that for the deployment in Congo alone, about 400 women were repatriated together with the UPDF. And this is our center of analysis. We are asking, who are these women? Are they survivors? Are they collaborators? Are they peacemakers? And by asking these questions, we are trying to move away from the overarching theme, sexual violence. If you are in this area of study, sexual violence has been foregrounded for many decades, and women's agency has been silenced, set aside. Just by asking this question, we are trying to foreground women's agency, and also listening to the women and interpreting their experiences. We can deduce that the women are not only vulnerable, but they are also survivors, they are collaborators, and they are peacemakers. The methods we did explore women's experiences especially the transnational military wives from DRC, Congo, Guinea. All these are countries where Uganda deploys, Rwanda. Yeah? But for this meeting, I will only talk about the military wives from DRC. We interviewed them in especially training centers near military bases. Gulu district hosts the 4th Division, which is the base for the foot soldiers, and most of the military wives, or transnational military wives, live in Gulu. In this study, we have narratives and transcripts. I've lost track, but we have over 100 of them. Some of the narratives include, I came with my spouse in 2001. We came by a military helicopter. We were brought directly to Gulu. But in Gulu, I found I was just one of the wives. And there was another wife in the barracks. This is yet another narrative. We came by military trucks. We were left in Bombo barracks. But because there were so many changes in Bombo barracks, the station commander expelled all the new guests, yeah? Just to restore stability in the barracks. Since then, I live in Bobo Trading Center, and although I want to contact my spouse in the barracks, he has switched off his phone. This is yet another narrative. We were left behind because all lorries were full, military trucks. So we walked until we reached Bunagana from Ituri. Like these are distances of over 400 kilometers. Yeah. So if you realize the trucks are full and you want to join your spouse, you walk. And Bunagana, Arua, Kasese, those are like, strictly speaking, the official crossing points, but there are multiple informal paths across the Uganda-DRC border. So I imagine this story will only capture what happens at the official border point. But if you used a place where there's an informal path, you just entered. Yeah? All you needed to do is tell the neighbor, the people you meet, that I've come to join my spouse. He was fighting in DRC, but he was repatriated. Okay, but at Bunagana, we were stopped from entering Uganda. We stayed there for weeks, children crying, and the officers declined us from entering because we didn't have the documents. They told us to call our spouses. Most of us could not. After about a week, we were allowed to enter Uganda. Please note that the local media also publicize this thing. Like, we have guests at the border points. Women, children stranded there. They are not neutral refugees. They have come to join, to reunite with their spouses. Why is the state policy against this? Yet we have seen most of the arrivals have already come by helicopters, trucks. Yeah? So there was a big debate there, but it was resolved by allowing all women and children affected by war, and especially if you have a reason to join your spouse. That was enough for you to come into my country. Okay. Thank you, thank you. So I think I'll rise straight to the conclusion then. So as I asked in the beginning, are women survivors? Are they collaborators? Are they peacemakers? Lots of discussions have gone on before, and we will also listen from your experiences, and we will listen from your analysis, because most of the discussions in the journals are interpretations of interpretations, and we know that researchers are not producing value-free knowledge. They decide, and sometimes they align with the normal dominant discourses. I thank you for listening to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we, we've got a number of speakers, so I'm just thinking maybe we could take one or two questions which are specifically about the topic, and then open it up for a longer discussion at the end is probably the best way of doing it. So if anyone has a burning question now, please raise your hand for Grace. Otherwise, we'll move on to our next speaker and we'll gather the questions at the end. You're off the hook, Grace.
I was translating quickly in GESI. So this question from Baguma, my colleague. He says there's already a presence here in DRC. I'm sorry. There's already a presence of the UPDF in DRC, and there's a mechanism of protection. Is there a mechanism of protection in place to prevent the risks that took place in 2001? So are there any strategies to sort of, I guess, learn from the experience of the 2001 to ensure protection?
Grace, do you have any thoughts about that in response to that? Maybe come and stand here, because then people will hear more easily, those who are online.
I was quickly translating
Can they say a few words about that scenario?
Yeah, just further, keep it on.
Uganda is great in DRC. Why is that? There's so many other groups in DRC. And when they destabilize the situation, Uganda is met with this big problem to carbon needles by the. So sometimes it's in strategic, it's Uganda's strategic interest to pacify this area. And this is, I suspect, for the DRC. Of course, there are different implications to their presence, can including displacement of women, violence, killings. Even Uganda military reports over 100 deaths in a day. How do we deal with these protracted conflicts? I think this should be our main question. And how should we ensure that when they leave peace, and they can go on normal in their lives?
Well, that gets translated rapidly. Can I ask, is it Miguel, who's our next speaker, to come up? You've been very involved in helping with the creation and architecture.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
How much time do I have?
You have 10 to 12 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. An honor being here with you. An honor also to be joining the panel with people I've been following for a long time. Also, thank you very much for hosting the panel. I'm going to talk about Mexico and disappearance. I'm going to give you a quick session at the beginning about facts and the state of the art and what's happening in regards to this issue. And basically the question behind all this is who's looking for them? Who's missing and who's looking for them? And the answer is their mothers. And they have organized in search groups, and we are learning from them. And this knowledge has been tested in experimental sites. And what we do is eventually incorporate this knowledge into the official search protocols in Jalisco, Mexico, which is the state with the largest numbers of disappeared in the country, with 16,000. We created this image using AI based on the stories of the mothers. I'm going to tell you more in a bit more. But the idea behind it was a phrase expressed by a mother when she said, I found my son in the flowers. And this is because they look for signs in nature, trying to locate the clandestine graves. And in this specific case, there was a very specific flower as well called Flor de Vida, which means flower of life. And that's one of the bio indicators that moms are using in Mexico to locate the graves. Turns out that when you use multispectral cameras mounted on drones, for example, you realize that, yes, bodies are releasing nutrients like nitrogen. Nitrogen is creating anomalies in chlorophyll, and you can see the anomalies in chlorophyll. And basically, this is a very, very clear expression of how these people become life, in the words of these mothers. I think, can you move this? Fred, please. Thank you very much. So really quickly, 118,000 individuals have reported as disappearing in Mexico. And let's stop just a couple of seconds to think about the magnitude of the issue. That's like Wembley Stadium, but not just the stands, also the grass, completely full of people, but that's just the people that have disappeared. How about the families? And about the friends? Think about your network, and then you can imagine the size of the problem. 80% have disappeared since 2006, coinciding with the declaration of war, of the war on drugs by the Mexican authorities. When this happened, it was very public in 2006, it was deployed in 2007, and it was an incentive for the cartels to get the weapons, to expand change the methods, and the turf war began. So the thing is, you see the issue of disappearance, instead of being just an instrumental use of violence in which they could get rid of the other cartel members, they're using it as expressive, expressing violence. So they're using violence to send a message. The idea is, if you are against me in my land, your family is going to look for you for the rest of their lives. That is the message, and that's what happens. The Mexican authorities don't have the incentive to look for them because, as you can imagine, try to imagine two columns. One is called disappearance, and that's very bad for the image of the Mexican authorities. And the other one is called homicide, which is even worse. So if you're actually very successful at finding the bodies, that means you're increasing your numbers for homicide. So what we did in the project after talking with the mothers was defining a new way to approach the issue, because we knew the technology was working. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And although controversial from different levels, at the moral level, it was something that was worth a try. And what we did was creating a third column, and we call it closure for mothers. So the idea is, as long as we are, or the mothers or the government is finding the graves, the bodies have been located, they are being identified, and the remains are given back to the families, now the government in Mexico is talking about providing or contributing to provide closure instead of finding clandestine graves. Again, this is a very heavy discussion and morally, uncomfortable at several levels, but that's what's allowing us to experiment and to show you what I'm about to show you. We can talk more about how we got to this conclusion and the discussion we have with mothers about this. 2,000 graves have been found so far. I just have an idea about the connection with the border in the U.S. Over 200,000 firearms are smuggled annually from the U.S. to Mexico, although according to David Perez Esparza, the former director of the Center for Information from the government of Mexico, this number could be closer to 400,000 annually. And 74% of these firearms are traced back to American manufacturers and importers. So someone is making a lot of money with what's happening in Mexico. I want to tell you more about search groups. So the question at the beginning was, who's looking for them? And the answer is the mothers. So I'm very conscious of time. I'm going to skip a couple of details, but this is what I want to tell you about this. They organize themselves in what they call colectivos de búsqueda, search groups. And it's mainly the mothers because it is mainly the men that are disappearing and the children. So they are looking for the children. They look for signs in nature. They stick a metal stake in the ground. Once they find the sign, they smell it to try to find the smell of decomposition, which is a confirmation. And if that's the case, they recover the remains. Can we move forward? These are examples of the clues they find. That's the one in the middle is La Flor de Vida, the one I was telling you at the beginning. it's very incredible that the name of the flower is actually that is becoming increasingly, at least in the center of Mexico, an indicator. There's not a lot of literature about bioindicators. There's a couple in Chile. There's one that we just published. But the idea is to study this a bit more and eventually find some other ways to be able to find even more. Just a quick idea about the poppy that was grown in Belgium and France during the World War, and the First World War, and that became, the symbol of the Day of Remembrance. The thing is, with the bombings, the layers of the soil are mixed, and this new mixture creates a new chemical environment. And in the new chemical environment, only very specific plants can thrive. And because only they can thrive, sometimes they dominate the scenario. So you see, it's not always about the extra amount of nutrients, sometimes it's about the new chemical composition. But the mothers are able to see these changes in the terrain. Sometimes they see, as you can see in this image, the extra amount of humidity is going to be creating patches of green grass on the top of it, like the other image, for example, or they can see the pressures in the terrain. And again, once they teach us these things, we can use or repurpose technology to locate the grade. For example, the changes in terrain can be tracked using lasers mounted on drones. And I already told you about the multispectral cameras. And really quickly, just so you know, I left the phrase in Spanish because it was expressed in Spanish, and I feel like it's important that we join their voices. It means from the people that we find in the graves, that life is creating more life. And we are talking about flowers and animals and insects. At the end, all disappear are not completely dead, because wherever they are, life grows. So what we do is we gather testimonies from mothers. We interview them every 4 months. I'm going again next week, for example. And it's very interesting to learn directly from them because they're in the field and they know firsthand what's happening, the changes in the leadership in the cartel de Jalisco, for example. And with new leadership, new actors, sometimes the new methods. And sometimes we can also be able to track this. And that means variables that we can eventually take into account to define the search areas and shrink the search areas. So as you see, this is a cycle of mutual reinforcement in which we are getting information from them. We're nurturing the search protocols. And eventually, once this turns into search protocols, official search practices, this has effects in the lives of the search groups. So we go from practice to theory and again to practice. And again, that image in the middle is the representation of I found them in the flowers because of that reason, which is what's driving us as a team. Again, conscious of time, so I'm going to run a bit. I'm sorry for this image. I know it's not graphic, it's very heavy. Yes, those are bodies, fragmented bodies in plastic bags, but I'm not even showing you this image for the bodies. Look at the background and you're going to see a green tree. It's the only green tree in the background. And that is because the roots of the tree were connected to the grave. So he was being nurtured by the grave. But this is very relevant for the following. When you use multispectral cameras or hyperspectral cameras on the drones, you can see the anomalies on the leaves of this tree. So the thing is, once we learn this from the mothers, we can learn how to track variables like this or evidence like this, indicators like this. We also discover through their knowledge that this type of tree, that's a huizache, they have roots that go mainly downwards, they pivotant, instead of radial or horizontal. And that means, in their words, that narcos are using these trees because they're providing shade, but at the same time, they're not struggling to dig the graves. So you see, they're helping us to define the variables. So now we can use AI, that's what we're developing right now, for vegetation recognition. So once we shrink the search areas, we can identify these trees and we can prioritize search areas. But again, this was something we learned from the mothers. Thank you for it. A new problem, there's 76,000 abandoned houses in Jalisco. This is an example, 500 houses. This is a house complex of 500 houses. They're all abandoned. Basically, corruption. They allow people to build these places. When people buy the houses and they get there, there's no electricity or rubbish collection or schools and so on. So they leave the places. But you see, now they belong either to the company or to someone else. And now narcos, the cartel members, are using these private places to deposit the remains, and they dig the graves, and then eventually they put new cement layers. So the mothers go inside, they hit the floor looking for a very specific sound. They hit the floor with a metal stake, the same one that I showed you in the first image, and they describe it as a tin, tun, and the tun means an anomaly. And then they proceed to break a chunk of the cement layer, and they recover the remains. So we're using seismic instrument to replicate the same concept. The seismic instrument is going to be sending information and energy, and it's going to be measuring how it bounces back. But the difference is it doesn't only work to locate the remains or find the anomaly. It's also useful from the bureaucratic or legal aspect of the issue, because you shouldn't go into private premises. That's illegal. Clearly, mothers will do what it takes. Some of them go to jail. There's some different process with NGOs trying to fix that. But in the meantime, this instrument is both finding the remains and providing information for the General Attorney's Office to issue the search warrants, so that eventually the premises can be checked legally. Again, as you see, we will learn from the mothers. We're about to close. Yes, really quickly. This is one of the experimental sites that we have. Since yesterday, it's official that we're going to have 4 more. We have 2 currently. And what I want to say really quickly about experimental sites, again, we test experimental sites, and then they become official practices in the Search Commission in Jalisco. In these places, the idea is not for them to represent geographically the landscape of Jalisco. For example, this one in Cajititlan, Tlajomulco is the municipality in Jalisco, represents only 4.7% of the landscape of Jalisco, but 60% of the previously found clandestine graves in Jalisco are in Cajititlan. So it was very important for us to understand from the place where they are actually carrying out these activities. And we also have one, the next one, Fred, thank you very much. This one in a university in Guadalajara, in which we can test in an environment that's going to be more easily replicable in other spaces in the center and the north of Mexico. So that's why it's drier, the soil is harder, etc. And I think there's a last one. Yeah, an example of this is electrical resistivity. Basically, we insert nodes in the soil, and then we can see basically if the bodies are still decomposing, we can see like the wear plastic, the wear bags of water. I'm going to go to more details eventually, but there's no time. And one last one. The last thing is, with the information of the previously found graves, we are gathering information, especially focusing in coordinates. The idea is to be able to find patterns, delimit SH areas, map, show hotspots, and as I was telling you, also add vegetation recognition. So the idea is, with all this knowledge and the partnership that we now have with the Search Commission in Jalisco, to be able to incorporate these insights in the model, so eventually becomes even better. And just one last idea. Some of the things that we're incorporating are, for example, things that look counterintuitive. For example, you wouldn't go to a mountain that's made of rocks. That's not the place that typically the cartels would choose to deposit the bodies, but mothers go. And they discovered that, for example, with electrical towers, for them to be placed in these mountains, a vast amount of soil needed to be removed for the bases. And that soil eventually, because of the rain, goes into very specific places, and then there's graves in these places. And we also learn that from the models. So the idea to incorporate these variables in the model are also coming from ideas from the models. And this is especially relevant because 9 out of 10 of the clandestine graves that are being found in Mexico are through anonymous tips, typically coming from the cartel members. I'll tell you more about why eventually, hopefully in the questions, but we want to change that and stop, or at least decrease the over-relying in the interaction with the cartel members. And we just closed a partnership with some colleagues in Tijuana and Coahuila, and the idea is for this technology to be tested in the border to find migrants as well. So that's the next step for the project, and thank you very much.
That's a whole new dimension, role of new technology and how that is interweaving and shaping the social lives of those who've lost loved ones. So thank you for that. I could take one or two questions very, very quickly. We'll move on to the next. Is there someone up there? It's gone. Yes, please.
Miguel, that's super interesting project, and thank you for sharing that review. I was curious whether there's been any conversations with Indigenous communities in Canada around the residential school survivors, and that there's been a lot of community activism and also identifying the location of children who died at residential schools.
Should I get close?
Yeah.
The answer is not yet, but it would be really useful to make the content. The thing is, as you see, for example, in terms of technology, the technology is being repurposed for something that's helping us in Mexico. Some technology was in agave fields, for example, tracking nutrients and moisture from the plants that we use for tequila. So the thing is, experiences in other places can be transferable. We're exploring a collaboration with Syria right now. Turns out Carla Quintana is now the UN responsible for the search of missing people in Syria, and she's the former National Search Commissioner in Mexico. So the idea is, and that's also on purpose. So that's an example of how useful it would be to learn. Again, it's a very heavy topic, and learn from these experiences, with the history of Canada is something major. But again, it could be a path towards closure. And if there's knowledge there that can be used for this project, and from the project in Mexico to what's happening there, hopefully that connection can be established. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Please save your questions and we'll come back. Annie, you're next. It's a pleasure to introduce Annie Bunting from York University in
Thanks,
Canada.
Melissa.
And I think you're
And
also
my-
presenting with a colleague.
Yes. Oui, je vais présenter en anglais, mais je vais présenter avec mon collègue Martin Baguma, qui est présentement à Bunia, mais en ligne. No, on the orange slides. Yeah, on the PowerPoint. There we are. Yeah. Chloe, are you okay on a little bit of text? Martin had asked you, Miguel, online why they were being disappeared, so I did my best to explain, but he might want to ask you more. So just as we're setting up the slides, I'll just, in the interest of time, we're presenting a project generously supported by XCEPT, and I want to thank Chloe and Grace, Pembroke College, and XCEPT for facilitating my travel here, despite the fact that it is the middle of the night in Toronto. I will do my best to present clearly. I am presenting a collaborative project that is conducted with researchers from SOFEPADI, Martin Baguma being the research coordinator in Goma, currently talking to us from Bunia, as well as Heather Tasker and Cora Fletcher at Dalhousie University. Can I control it or no?
Try.
Yeah, c'est ça. Yeah, great. So just in the context of the questions that were posed to us as panelists, I wanted to very quickly sort of talk about how we have situated our research in relation to these questions. We won't be able to go through them all, but I look forward to the day's conversations when we're talking about issues, as Grace has really set us up well, around vulnerability, agency, gender, and cross-border conflict. And in this project, we taken as an assumption that vulnerability is not something that makes people passive, but rather that survivors of conflict violence are actually able to respond to and be affected by and affect their circumstances. And you may know the work of Riviera et al., and they talk really well about this ability to be affected and to affect circumstance. And here as well, given that we're talking about Eastern DRC, Chloe already introduced the fact that this is an ongoing war, and most of the women with whom we spoke in December 2020 24 have already been displaced once again, as well as our researchers who were based in Goma, who many of whom also have been directly affected by the ongoing war. And Martin is in Bunia, for example. Many other people have also obviously left Goma. And so the results that I'm sharing with you today come from 119 interviews conducted in December 2019 with internally displaced persons, all women, and then also 30 social workers, activists, survivors group representatives, medical workers, and so on. But we were interested, and Chloe and Grace asked us also to think about the continuum of violence. And here that continuum has to do with causes of displacement, experiences of displacement, and then gender violence in the internally displaced persons camps. And here as well, we're asked to think about the ways in which research can facilitate advocacy. And in our project, because we do work with SOFEPADI and other NGOs, we're very interested in the ways in which organizations of survivors and NGOs alike actually are using research in their advocacy, both nationally, very locally, nationally, and internationally. And spoiler alert, one of the major surprises that we found in this, so should you tune out after this is the takeaway, is that despite the violence conducted by their own government, including sexual violence by the Congolese military, women survivors of gender violence continue to call upon their police forces and their government army for protection. And despite the fact MONUSCO has been there as apparently a protective force for civilians, they are not calling on MONUSCO for protection in and around IDP camps or in their home communities. Almost all of the displaced women actually witnessed or stated that they were victims of sexual and gender-based violence. We were not interested in this project in asking about their experiences of gender and sexual violence, gender-based and sexual violence. Rather, we were interested in their perceptions of the risks and its contributing factors to displacement. We were not interested and yet women talked a lot about their experiences of sexual and gender-based violence. So, as many of you are very familiar in this room, sometimes women will narrate what they expect researchers want them to be talking about. So that is something that one has to be always really mindful of in this context. So 73% of respondents overall, that's the 119, both community-based workers, survivors groups members, as well as the 89 displaced women, said that they were victims of or witnessed violence. 97% of displaced women said that. M23, unsurprisingly, was overwhelmingly identified as that group responsible for their displacement. When you added RDF forces, it went up to over 75% of displaced women. And yet, and again, and I think this is an important thing for us to think about, is the ways in which conflict facilitate gender violence more broadly. And so, consistent with other research in other contexts, it's not just the M23 that is responsible for sexual violence in Eastern DRC. Rather, what we found, and this is consistent with Kelly and others' work, that in fact it is a situation of chaos and intensification of conflict that then facilitates violence by other groups, in particular, actually non-state actors and including civilians, importantly. So here, displaced women talked about Wazalendo, yes, armed men, unknown, bandits, the M23 soldiers who spoke Kinyarwandan. For women in IDP camps, and I should say, because this was a question actually that Melissa asked me last night. So the 6 camps, 3 were in and around Goma. And the 6 camps were Bushagara, Bulengo, Lushagala, Rusayo 1 and 2, and Sam. And most of the displaced women came from the Masisi region or Rutshuru. So most were those coming from those 2 regions to these 6 IDP camps. And here you can see overwhelmingly, the colors are a little bit tricky, but the largest cohort is women identified M23 as being responsible for their displacement. An interesting thing here as well is that sexual and gender-based violence was also identified as a factor in causing their displacement. So it's often in the literature you hear or you read about gender violence during displacement or in IDP camps, but there was a clear indication. Again, we didn't ask for people to tell us about experiences of sexual violence, but nonetheless, they talked about it as being a push factor in their displacement, causing their displacement. And here, again, it wasn't necessarily that they had experienced it, but it was also the risk of, right? So the fear of gender-based violence that caused them to leave. Also, obviously, a very heavy topic. Thank you for reminding us of that, Miguel. And it was also obviously witnessing violence, right? Witnessing losing their family members, children seeing their parents harmed. They clearly identified M23 in ways in which, as researchers, were comfortable and sometimes uncomfortable talking about, but language was often that was used to identify. Also, to some extent, uniforms and other such things. How am I doing on time? Okay, perfect. I am getting close because I also want to give Martin a couple of minutes, and he's also available to answer your questions. So about the current context and also how research might be useful. When you compare the 30 community-based social workers, service providers, and activists, their perspectives with displaced women, you can see here that that key informants, the folks who are working in the IDP camps that are now all 6 are emptied out from our most recent data, SOFEPADI. All 6 of the IDP camps where we did the interviews in December have been emptied out as a result of the M23 attacks. But you can see here that the groups responsible for the violence in the camps is not that's not the M23, right? And here there's a lot of displaced women identifying other groups. And one of the main recommendations coming from SOFEPADI and others is getting the arms out of camps, because the militia group and the arms are in circulation in the camps to such an extent that is increasing vulnerability to violence, in everyday violence in the camps. And you can only imagine, obviously, what's happening now. So as well, I think the idea of conflict intensification is important for us to think about in relation to all of the contexts in which we work, and the idea also of proximity of the conflict to displaced persons camps. The closer the conflict, the more likely, the higher, more likelihood for there to be violence in the camps, obviously, and that was true in the camps where we were doing the interviews. I just wanted to, yeah, it's time. Yeah, I just want to give Martin an opportunity to answer any questions. So feel free to ask questions, and we'll do a quick translation. Chloe, how are we doing online there? I'm not sure. I'm getting 3. Okay, yes, the only one I got, Chloe, was another question for Miguel, which I'll ask you later from Martin. But we'll take our one question, I guess, and happy to give that question to Martin.
Right.
You're welcome.
Yes, please do.
Thank you. So fascinating. I just thinking back to some work out within Myanmar, and I wondered if in this setting you found there were pressures on women to not report, or from community mechanisms to suppress experiences of women's violence, because that community is at war, and the onus of knowing who is the aggressor is always on the external force. So I wonder if there was some experience of women not being able to report, or these instances not being given the importance because of this pressure to maintain this community integrity and maybe of a united community.
Yeah. I'll ask Martin if he wants to respond to that. I would say Actually, no, because it's been going on for so long, and that SOFEPADI has excellent relations, and we have found that women are clearly calling out MONUSCO, they're calling out FARDC, they're calling out civilians, and they're getting accompaniment where they can, and they're seeking medical attention quite quickly, well, especially in an IDP camp setting. Yeah. Est-ce que Martin, est-ce qu'il y a... Okay. Okay, he made... Oui, vas-y, Martin. Est-ce que vous avez quelque chose à ajouter?
Oui, en fait, tout à fait, par rapport aux résultats des recherches que nous avons menées au niveau de sites de personnes déplacées autour des Roma. On voulait donc cette recherche, le résultat de ces recherches va vraiment contribuer comme un mécanisme de plaidoyer au niveau même du gouvernement congolais, mais aussi à faire des plaidoyers à différentes instances pour prendre des mesures positives pour prévenir et protéger les femmes contre toute violence et aussi de punir aussi les auteurs d'actes de violence commises pendant cette crise. Et comme vous le savez, la RDC traverse une situation vraiment catastrophique. Nous sommes en Ituri, c'est toujours le même problème, les attaques des cas de personnes déplacées par des groupes armés. Et en Ituri, il y a les groupes comme Codeco, ça fait des semaines, ils sont en train d'attaquer les sites, les femmes sont tuées, et les enfants, et ça constitue vraiment une violation de droits humains. Je pense à travers les résultats de cette étude, ça pourrait aussi nous aider à mener aussi des recherches des impacts des conflits aussi dans d'autres coins de la République, là où la violence elle est vraiment très élevée. Je pense que c'est ça comme contribution.
Merci beaucoup, Martin. Nous allons faire la traduction ici dans la salle et aussi dans le chat. So the contribution for those of you who speak French, you got it. But Martin was just adding about how at the end talking about the ongoing conflict and what they're living through now in Ituri, but also that the research will facilitate their advocacy in relation to the government of DRC. Merci, Martin.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for joining online too. Merci beaucoup. It's about the limit of my French. Next up, we have computers. Anna Strachan. Anna, welcome.
Thank you.
Anna is from Bodhi Global Analysis.
Yeah, Bodhi Global Analysis.
Yeah. And you'll talk gender norms, identities and roles in contributing to conflict dynamics and peace-building possibilities in northern Mozambique.
Hang on, sorry, I'm just trying to... Oh, you've got it. So we undertook this research last year with funding from XCEPT. And the research focused, as you can see on there, the gender dimensions of cross-border conflict between Mtwara region in Tanzania and Cabo Delgado in Mozambique. And so we do have a map there somewhere. Yeah, there we go. So maybe we start off with the overarching research questions, which are on the next slide. Yep. Okay, so we had two overarching research questions and two kind of secondary questions, quite ambitious there. So the first question was around how gender norms, identities and roles among cross-border communities have shaped conflict dynamics in northern Mozambique. And then in relation to that, how the gender dimensions of cross-border livelihoods have shaped and been impacted by the conflict. And the second question focused around how the gendered and cross-border impacts of the conflict have presented challenges and opportunities to women, especially in relation to playing a bigger role in conflict resolution and prevention, as well as in peace building, and whether the conflict has advanced or hindered opportunities for women more generally. Just move on to the map. So there you can see the areas that we focused on. So we looked at Mweda, Palma, and Nangade in Mozambique, and Mutawara in Tanzania. So in terms of the methods that we used, we did undertake an in-depth kind of document review, and then we spoke to 228 individuals through focus groups and key informant interviews. We did have challenges because of the sensitivity of the topic in obtaining research permissions in Tanzania. So the interviews there were remote. So most of the primary data does come from Palma and Mweda in Mozambique. So that just needs to be flagged. And all the focus groups then did take place in northern Mozambique and not in Tanzania. So in terms of the key findings that came out of it, the first is that men and women's involvement in and contribution to the conflict in northern Mozambique has largely aligned with prevailing gender norms and roles. So most of the Al-Shabaab leaders and fighters are in fact men and boys, in accordance with patriarchal norms that cast men as leaders, protectors and providers. And most men, in contrast to women, do join Al-Shabaab in Mozambique voluntarily. Women, on the other hand, while some do join voluntarily, that seems to be the minority, and most are in fact forcibly recruited, often through abductions. Women's roles generally consist of support roles, like the provision of logistical support, transporting money and weapons across the border, for example, but they also engage in some more active conflict roles like espionage. And women's motivations, if they do join the group voluntarily, are at least in part related to opportunities for social and political empowerment, where they maybe feel that they have a greater possibility of participating in decision-making or have some sense of agency there. Some women, but I have to say very few, based on the data that we have, also have taken on combat roles, which of course is then in contrast to the prevailing gender norms in these areas, but this is really a minority. In terms of the economic impacts of the conflict, these have affected men and women differently, shaped primarily by their gendered experiences of socioeconomic participation prior to the start of the conflict. So men were the primary providers at the household level, with families relying on their income from either informal employment, agriculture, or trade to meet household needs. But insecurity in border areas has resulted in large-scale unemployment among men, also resulting in greater food insecurity and poverty for entire households. So the primary coping mechanism reported by respondents in Mozambique for dealing with these economic challenges, when talking to male respondents, was that men have been forced to accept jobs as casual laborers in businesses and farms, often exploited because of their precarious situation and paid very small wages. Whereas on the Tanzanian side, and bearing in mind that we have less data from this side, the main coping mechanisms did appear to be recruitment into Al-Shabaab and migration. So for women, as I said, this was a bit different. So women's roles were primarily domestic before the conflict, but they did engage in some economic activity outside the house, primarily through small-scale agriculture, at much higher rates on the Tanzanian side of the border than on the Mozambican one, and also in some informal business and cross-border trade. Before the conflict, women who engaged in economic activity were fairly free to use their income to supplement husbands' incomes and focus on those responsibilities that maybe their husbands were not prioritizing. So it came across that women would use that extra income to provide care to their children, for example, or elderly family members. And this also gave them some influence over decision-making in the household and in terms of how household income would be spent. After the start of the conflict, women found it harder to adapt generally to the new economic realities. And they often found themselves relegated to solely domestic roles, showing how there has been kind of a regression in some degree to women's agency. What became clear is even when women have been able to take on greater leadership, roles with responsibilities, for example, bringing in income, this has not resulted in a significant change in their decision-making power in the family. Another finding was that there has been a significant increase in sexual and gender-based violence against women. This has mainly occurred when women have been driven further away from their homes to collect water and firewood and to buy food and goods as a result of the conflict. Despite these risks, they've had to continue to undertake these tasks. But there has also been a marked increase in domestic violence. And this is seemingly due to the fact that men are spending more time at home and due to unemployment and lack of economic activities. And many respondents also talked about frustrations in the household around this lack of ability to fulfill their role as provider for the household. The impact of complex security measures has increased women and girls' vulnerability and their exposure to protection and security risk, underlining the unintended consequences of the securitization of the border between Tanzania and Mozambique. So there has been an increase in women-headed households in Tanzania due to the economic impacts of insecurity and the securitization of the borderlands, with some men pushed to either abandon their families or leave them to search for employment elsewhere. In contrast, in Mozambique, respondents spoke about women-headed households having increased because men had been abducted or died during conflict. Women's coping mechanisms have been quite varied. One example was women resorting to growing vegetables in poorly patrolled areas, doing this in secret and risking arrest, for example, by security forces, knowing that this was the only option they had to secure food. Also, with limited access to markets, many of these women did resort to selling the food they produced to groups linked to Al-Shabaab or to Al-Shabaab themselves. Several women on the Tanzanian side of the border also have resorted to marrying Al-Shabaab fighters or giving their daughters away to Al-Shabaab members as a coping mechanism. This is something we also saw on the Mozambican side of the border. There was also talk about an increase in forced child marriage, and there are a number of studies on this by organizations like Save the Children that have been looking in this as well, and it's seen as a kind of relieving a burden on families and reducing the costs that they would have within the household. And finally, there was also talk amongst respondents about a rise in transactional sex as a coping mechanism, particularly among women heads of households who have no alternatives to secure income to feed their families. It's clear from the research that the impacts of the conflict have had a mixed impact on gender roles, with limited, if any, impact on gender norms. So where there is an increased presence of men, this appears to have further constrained women's agency and made their lives more difficult than it was before, reducing their decision-making power. Gender norms do constrain women's agency by enforcing gendered power relations that prioritize male needs and decisions above women's, no matter what the conditions are. So even when the situation in the community or the household is fraught. Despite the increasing burden on women and the fact that many of them are losing their decision-making power, women very often in the responses, actually expressed a sense that men were suffering more than they were, and had a sense of pity and sadness for the men's experience. So the idea was that men had, lost the ability to provide for the families and they felt sorry for them. And this meant that means that men in many ways escape accountability for violence when perpetrated by them in the household. We have, however, seen, as we mentioned, especially that women-headed households have, of course, had to take on roles traditionally reserved for men in terms of generating income for households. But this, as I mentioned before, has not really had a huge impact on gender norms more broadly within these communities. Women, on the other hand, have stepped into some areas that are new for them, such as reconstruction. In areas of IDP returns, there were examples of women organizing themselves to pressure local authorities on reconstruction priorities and also to engage in construction themselves. And while rare, women heads of household had also been involved in some community governance initiatives. So taking on community leadership roles, joining local councils, advising men in conflict resolution. But again, I must stress that this really is a minority of cases. We're almost at the end. Yeah. So just on the final finding that we had seen the international and national CSOs and NGOs have played an important role in encouraging this women's participation through training on conflict management, community-based development initiatives, etc. And there were women who spoke about having skills and confidence to try and at least seek out opportunities to make a difference in their communities despite the constraints. And there were examples, for example, of traditional birth assistance, peace clubs, cooperatives, and village savings and loans associations all playing an important role in trying to bring about change. Okay.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. So I could take one question before we move on to our final speaker. It's always hard when people are digesting questions. I think what we'll do is, in the interest of time, we'll move on and then we'll come back to it.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Talk raises a lot of very big questions. So our final speaker is Hilina Berhanu Degefa, who's joining us online. I hope she has a good connection. Can you hear us? Hilina?
Yes, yes.
Oh, wonderful.
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Okay. So you're going to talk, I understand, on women's participation in non-state armed groups in Ethiopia.
Yes. I don't know if you can see me. Can you see me? Because I do have my video on, but...
Not yet.
Okay. And that's fine. I think my slide is with the thumb on there, but I can also share my screen. That can be launched.
I think they're working on it. Just bear with us just for a minute. We'll let you know when the slide goes up.
Not that one.
Maybe if they can share there.
Yeah. Would you be able to share your slides?
Yeah, yes.
Oh, wait, we found it. We found it.
Sorry.
Fabulous. Okay. We can now see your slides and we can hear you. So I think we'll settle for that.
Hi, everyone. I guess that's the disadvantage of presenting online. Oh, you can see my slides?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Thank you. Off you go.
So my topic of research is women's participation in netting and international community and actors in Ethiopia. And the reason I ended up doing this work is because the next slide is because, in Ethiopia we have several ethnic and international conflicts. But as you can see in the picture, the majority of that engagement involves a lot of men smiling, men not smiling on the end, but it's never women who are at that table seated and having a conversation around what it means to now have achieved peace, if you can say that peace is achieved. And as a result, I thought, the third slide, sorry. As a result, I thought maybe it might be a good idea then to ask, because we have different groups within the region that are actively fighting, but also those who've now signed peace agreements. So I thought maybe it would be a good idea to see and engage with women's contribution in that space. Because surely, from the many armed actors that I know that I've seen, there are a lot of women that are laboring in that space, which are not recognized by the end of it. So I've looked into forces in the region of Tigray, Oromia, and Somali. And just to give you a bit of a context background, Ethiopia is a population of 120 million. And these populations account for close to 100. And so this is not something that we can neglect in terms of the extent of engagement. And these groups tend to represent either ethnicity or ethno-nationality, which is usually found across borders and across different ethnic groups. And in no way am I trying to compare their experiences or their experiences of injustice or why they came to be. But I thought it would be great to see their experiences of those who are not necessarily fighting and actively fighting in that sense, has achieved the peace agreement, and those that are still actively on the ground. Next slide. And I want to center my conversation around the ethics of research, but also how I chose to engage. I am an Ethiopian myself, and the reason that I had access to those groups is because both of my families belong to two territories that are on the opposing ends of the fighting. And some of the people that have joined the armed actors were, either former colleagues, people that I knew in my community, because, being an Ethiopian or coming from the southern space doesn't necessarily give you automatic access to places. And I don't want to have, go with that assumption. And it was really important for me to have a feminist methodology of engagement. The majority of the people that I spoke to, the experiences that I centered on purpose were women. The translators that I used, the drivers that I used, even the fixers, I made sure were women because it was important for me to hear different kind of stories. And I understood that each and every one of them had a story to tell and to contribute to my research. And the sites that I've explored, as you can see, is between the Ethiopian-Kenyan border. And actually, this is my first time crossing the Kenyan and Ethiopian border on foot, and all thanks to XCEPT. I've never done it on foot before, and it's crossing that border and experiencing it physically, but also asking the same questions on why women involved in these groups and how exactly are they defining their agency and their contribution within that space. So I've looked into Shire in Tigray and Nairobi and Addis and in other spaces to kind of engage not just those who are in the borders, but also hearing from the center as well. Next slide. And this is a quote from one of my colleagues in the XCEPT research, my colleague from Pakistan, and we were worried about how do we go about this? How do we go to the field and access the people that we wanted to access? Because let's be honest, we are women from a certain privileged group, and these are, not necessarily accessible territories and accessible conversations to us. And I was very much worried about it as well. But what ended up for me is, as much as I was worried about going into the field, I think getting out of the field was a bit difficult. And that's why I wanted to discuss positionality and ethics of research, because I am a Southern woman and I really believed in owning and telling our story as Ethiopians. And I thought I would bring in a different sensitivity, having understood the context for years and years, but also being very conscious about the positionality that I occupy in this research process, whether it's global south, global north, or also within the global south, the kind of space that I occupy. So it was a bit of a struggle, kind of living in that story, not necessarily feeling that I'm not extracting information, but I'll go back to the communities, that I'll be accessible to them. And then I would provide some form of support. I felt like both an activist and a researcher, because being a researcher and just collecting data was not a privilege that I had. Again, as an Ethiopian, as coming from that community, but also having a feminist understanding and lens of engagement in that space. So I had a channel where they could contact me, because that's the kind of engagement that I've had prior. But also I wanted to do something in addition to, working in the policy field. And one of the areas of engagement that we're currently having, again, with the support of FCDO and others, is supporting one of the women ex-combatant organization, and trying to see, independent of research, if they can have those conversations and ask what they require within the DDR process, but also the transitional justice process in the country, including, how they were neglected in the peace agreement. So providing that space independent of research was very much important for me. So I actually did not leave the field in that emotional sense, although I've left it physically. Next slide. And the questions that I asked are questions that Chloe asked us as well. The research questions were an understanding why women join, but also hearing from them in their own words, in their own articulation, how they see their agency and influence within the political space, within the armed groups that I'm studying. And if there are gender tactics that are being used in the cross-border perspective and engagement. Next slide. And here I've incorporated what they said in their own words, and some of it was very much hard to translate, so I kept it as it is. This is the Amharic language, the language that I use to engage with some of the actors, not all of them. But what it says is እንደሴት ሳይሆን እንደ ሰራዊት ነው የተዋጋነው, which means we didn't fight as women, we fought as soldiers. And a lot of women, had active distance from their identity as women. And I understand that because it would not be to their benefit in that very masculine space. So they've always maintained that sort of identity. And some of them say my identity as a woman politicized came a lot later. So it's no nationality and it's no national identity was the center of their engagement, first and foremost. And then it's only then that they understood that they were women. For the majority of them, actually, their understanding of womanhood and gender equality came a bit later, maybe at the peace process or at the DDR engagement, because they didn't see that they were actively included in that sort of organizing, and they were left behind, as you hear it internationally, and it's not just specific to Ethiopia. And I just want to say the pictures that I've used are either taken by myself with the consent of those participating, or were taken from a public-facing platform of disarmed organizations. So with full consent, of course. Next slide. And some of them, for example, talked about, cooking or not cooking. Some of them said, we were not interested in cooking because if we started, going down that road, then it was going to put us back in our place, and they didn't like it. But other women said actually they find comfort in actively fighting during the day, but coming to their military bases and cooking at night because it gave them a form of home-like feeling and a form of peace. So it was divided between two sentiments. So it was never a straight line kind of argument and gender analysis that came out of it. Other women said that it was very hard to negotiate for their promotion within when they were part of the active conflict. And they said they had to use cadre language, which basically means speaking in, patriarchal terms that were familiar to the men that they were fighting with, right? So just kind of using their language, eventually understanding that there was a specific way of framing agency within that space so that they can get promotion, so that their voices can be heard. And then the other engagement around it was, them understanding, again, their experiences are different, but some of them say their peace was robbed by the men that were immediately living with them, fighting with them for the same cause. They thought, whether facing sexual violence, harassment of all forms, that they would be safe now that they have the gun, but that was not the case. And then one of the women said that my enemies were not coming from outside, they were also inside, they were in the bushes with me. So there was that kind of sentiment. And I just wanted to draw in what they'd said. Of course, there are much more other conversations coming out of that as well. Just to wrap up my presentation, maybe going into the next slide. The findings that came out of the questions that I've asked initially, which was why did they join, and what is their agency and understanding of their agencies like, and what is their role within cross-border perspective, is that many of them believed that they were born into context of social injustice, and they were treated as suspect communities. And because the violence coming from the military, the formal state actors, was cross-borders, that it was only fair that their engagement, their mobilization was also cross-border. So it was just matching of forces. And the second sentiment that came out is liberation first and the gender issue or gender equality after. And it was a sentiment not just shared by the women, but the men themselves, which I imagine is a bit common. And then we had a different understanding. Again, their experiences vary, but for the most part, at least a good 60% agreed that they were able to navigate transnational borders easily. And as a result, that they were able to mobilize and access it for armed actor in another form of engagement within the border. So it was easier for them to navigate that space. That's what I have for now. I'd be happy to take questions, but just at the final slide, maybe just introducing the work of XCEPT Women Research Fellows. If we come from different corners of the world, as you can see, Sudan, Pakistan, Algeria, Morocco, Myanmar. So if you have questions about what we do and how we engage, you can just go to XCEPT sites or the Degefa Foundation, and you'll find more information coming out of that space, including our reports. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. A very thoughtful and interesting presentation. I'll just take one question maybe, and then we'll have a bigger, broader discussion if anyone has anything burning they'd like to raise. So, yes.
I was going to ask, what are the consequences of women joining armed groups when it comes to domestic responsibilities, their own family, dependents? Who decides who looks after the children, or if they've got partners or husbands? How does that affect their social life?
Did you hear that okay?
I can answer to that.
Yeah.
A bit of disclaimer. I think the majority of the women who joined the armed forces were targeted, I think, for either being single or widowed women or divorced women. There was that kind of targeting as well. So they had, that kind of direction where they were not robbing families of those sorts of responsibilities, but at the same time, the other part of women who joined, having left their domestic responsibilities, because it's very typical in that context to be, carrying that sort of responsibility, either had husbands, even sisters and daughters, not just the men figures of the house, but also the women figures of the house, join the army. So it was done as a family kind of unionized, going into the bush together sort of activity. And once they get there, the responsibilities were either divided equally, and so they didn't have to do that kind of domestic role, or some volunteered to do it. So it depended from group to group. But those that still had family left behind, for example, in the case of ONLF and the women that I spoke to in ONLF, they said, that's the decision that they had to make, the highest form of sacrifice for them to leave families behind, and assumed that they would manage just fine. That the nation or the internationality cause was important enough for them to abandon that base and come and work in this one. And perhaps in that case, most of their families that were left behind were harassed and asked questions around that over and over again. And but that's a whole different dynamics. But they didn't. That sort of engagement is what came out. I hope I answered the question.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. I think now I might ask all our speakers who are in the room to come up to the front, and we'll then maybe we'll try and have a sort of bigger, wider discussion, draw out some issues or themes that connect these very interesting but also quite diverse papers.
Yeah, please.
Hilina, we can hear you loud and clear, but I think the bandwidth isn't quite strong enough to see you properly. So probably it's best to keep your camera off so that we're not distracted by pixelating images.
Asking, he was very engaged by your presentation. He said, what concrete action from the government is being put in place yet to protect women? Oh, but I know that the femicidio.
Okay, thank you for all your presentations this morning.
I feel a little bit like we're about to get.
Would anyone like to kick off with some questions for the panelists? Perhaps they could either answer in turn, or maybe even they could reflect on each other's presentations, so it doesn't. Yes.
Thank you so much, everyone, for presenting interesting and important work. I thought that was really great, interesting the way you're using nature as an indicator for conflict dynamics. When usually these things go the other way around. Is this on? Yeah. And I was wondering if you've seen any kind of like biodiversity loss or climate impacts that could be disrupting this work, or if this is included at all in your approach?
Okay. Wow. Yeah. So a quick idea before that. You see, in normal conflicts or traditional conflicts, the idea is that bombs, for example, are going to be having drastic effects in the landscape. And in this case, it is the landscape, the one that's conditioning the way the cartels are engaging with types of violence. So they're choosing the burial method, for example. That's one thing. The other one is the changes vary. So one of them is releasing nutrients, and then you see specific flowers because phosphorus, nitrogen, and then
But then the opposite also happens. Sometimes because of the layers being mixed, as I was saying, with ecological succession, that's the name of the process. The new chemical composition of the soil becomes a hostile environment for very specific species. And then some others start dominating, at least temporarily. So the thing is, what we know is that is the case. We don't know for how long, but we know that was the case for also one experiment in Chile, where it was more like a research, and they were following a very specific type of plant. So the idea is we can see this now, it's preliminary, but we know based on the knowledge, not just experience for the models, because they've been doing this for a long time, we know it works. And we know it could have very serious implications for the way we approach this issue. So the thing is, you see, in one case it might seem like it's producing the presence or allowing the presence of very specific plants, but that's also at the same time at the cost of others not being able to develop. So it's like both at the same time. And finding the patterns and being able to use it as a search method is the goal. And again, that is for Jalisco. And the idea is to be able to have these experiments also in Zacatecas, my home state, and then which is the one with the highest numbers in 100,000 inhabitants. That's the worst case scenario. 80% of the history of disappearance in Zacatecas has disappeared in the last 2 years, for example. So learning from these environments is very, very important because, yeah, the idea might be transferable, but the plants and the ecosystem is going to be different. But definitely works. So let's try to keep exploring that. Thank you.
I have a question for certainly 3, maybe 4 of you, which is, and I don't know if anyone wants to have a go at it, but it's whether or not you feel, what do you think about whether or not the hierarchies which there are during wartime get reproduced in peacetime or relative peace? I don't know, Grace, Anna, Hilina, maybe even Annie, you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, thank you, Melissa, for that question. Already at repatriation, we see how hierarchies are being reproduced in Uganda. So, for instance, the narratives which depict the women as those who came by flight really show that they are traveling back with, for instance, captains, majors, ranks in the army. I think Syra will relate to this. And then there are foot soldiers, corporals, very junior officers, and they are the majority. So we have back in Uganda, like we see these hierarchies, where they live, how they came, the experience they go through in Uganda as well, are quite similar to what we would see at the battlefront. Okay, but beyond this, we are also exploring just women's everyday lives, as anthropologists do. Beyond the association with the military, they have lives to live, and sometimes they're really precarious lives in Uganda. And we are trying to write like policy briefs, trying to raise awareness also with the military about their everyday lives.
Anna, Annie, Hilina, anything you'd like to add? Hilina, please go ahead. Yeah.
I think for me, armed conflicts and its no nationality, the structure of its no nationality specifically, tends to camouflage and be very hierarchies and be very deceptive in looking like the gender equality has been achieved just momentarily until, peace or some form of negotiation is achieved. And that is evidence in, for example, in DDR or peace agreement processes where, the majority of women who were seen as equals during international mobilization or during armed conflicts are not included, right? And I think in that sense, that hierarchy is not extended and maintained. And specifically when it comes to women, women are disposable in that sense where that sort of privilege is not extended to them in peace times or in post-conflict times, because post-conflict times are not necessarily peace times at all times. And maybe for some women, at least in my research, some women still had it extended of that privilege, but they were exceptional women. They were put in a whole different box. I remember a lot of women telling me about this general that still is considered as one of the men. And everyone was calling her like, oh no, she's 4 times a woman. She's not 1, but she's 4. So that kind of exceptional identity was created for some women. So that gender hierarchy or whatever form of hierarchy that you've had during armed conflict is extended and given to some, but not all. I wouldn't even say the majority. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very thoughtful answer. Anna, you look like you'd like to add.
I don't really have an answer, but I think it would be interesting. In the case of Northern Mozambique, we of course saw that also some women's roles had already regressed during wartime, right? So they actually had less decision-making power, even less decision-making power before. So, and less agency. So it would be interesting to see whether in a post-conflict context that reverts or whether that also remains the case and to undertake research on that. Yeah. Because that's always a look at positive, right? But also,
Well, I'll only add something very briefly. It would be interesting to look at the literature on post-liberation movements in Africa, and because in some of that literature it showed that gender roles changed, but then the window for change quickly closed, and so there were moments, and I think the same was after the Rwandan genocide. There was a window open and then closed for challenges to hierarchies in gender. It'd be interesting to look at participation in the context, for example, of Ethiopia, Uganda, and elsewhere, Mozambique, and then to look at liberation movements.
Tim.
I'll go last.
Go ahead, yes.
Thank you. I really enjoyed all those presentations. There's a lot of thanks for the great presentations. Lots of really interesting stuff in there. I mean, for me, one of the themes maybe that came through in a few of the presentations was around the way that gender norms can contribute to driving conflict, being used as a source of recruitment by armed groups, explicitly drawing upon traditional gender norms in order to attract support. And I think in northern Mozambique, you mentioned that explicitly. I think that came through in Ethiopia. I know in Mexico, and the cartels, it's a major issue. So I'd just be interested if in your research, in the work you've done, there are any kind of any more examples that you've got of what that looks like. How do armed groups do that, kind of draw upon those gender norms in an explicit manner in order to kind of generate their support base and well, yeah, that's it.
Well, if I can jump, I wasn't sure I was going to share this today, but I feel like this is the environment to talk about these things. So I'm going to draw to an example and something that happened in my home state 2 days ago. One of my best friends was kidnapped. He was recovered alive. The thing is, when he was found, he was with 10 more people, and there were 4 women, and they were recruited forcibly, and they were basically cooking for the cartel. So that's one of the things. The other thing is, this is mainly a war between men, and that's also, we know that's exactly what we're discussing this issue. There's a gender component there as well. Also, the fact that the mothers are the ones looking for them, and then the fact that in Mexico, especially the government, when they're against the search groups, for example, they refer to the lack of attention from the mothers to the rest of the family. You see, because there's more children, and they not all of them have disappeared, and the husband is still there, but the husband is not looking. He's providing. Quotes. And so you see, there's a lot of things. There's very interesting things as well, and interesting between also it's like quotes, because, for example, there's a very direct interaction between the search groups and some of the cartel members. So I was telling you that 9 out of 10 in Jalisco are found because of anonymous tips, anonymous calls, messages. So the thing is, sometimes they even go to the search efforts and they tell them where the graves are. Sometimes they refer to details like rings, tattoos, which means they were there or they did it themselves. And when the mothers ask why they're telling them, they say, you know, I'm not doing this for you. It's because when it happens to me, I know my mom is going to reach out to you. So I'm helping you so you can eventually help my mom. So you see, it's everything at the same time, but clearly there's a gender component as well. And again, it is also a bit frustrating from the perspective of trying to do something, working alongside them, to hear the government say that they are failing the rest of the family because they're looking for one of their members. When the state should not allow people to disappear and they should be the ones looking. So, yeah. Basically, I wanted to draw to this example, basically also about the fact that they were kidnapped in Zacatecas for these purposes of cooking for the cartel, for example. That's one of the clear examples.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Tim.
Thank you. I thought it was. Is it working? Did I shout? Should we shout? Okay. I thought they were really interesting presentations, and there were sort of surprising things in several of them. And I thought your point about that people are going to the local police and the national army, people for whom they must have had previous experiences of abuse. They will go to those people rather than to international actors, to the peacekeeping forces. I thought that was a very revealing. You left it hanging, but it seemed like rather a significant point about what's been going on, and this, and perhaps kind of symptomatic of how international engagements are perceived in these areas, and that, you know, very well-meaning international actors working for NGOs or working for peacekeeping forces think they're doing something really positive for the population, but they don't have a moral connection with people. And actually, when it comes to it, people turn to other places, I suppose, and people they're comfortable with, even if those are people who abuse them. So I thought that was really a thought-provoking point. But that wasn't really my question, actually. but it's more an observation. But I was just thinking about the topic, you know, women agency and violence across borders. And I just wonder whether there's a difference between those things that occur across borders compared with those kinds of violence that occur within borders. I mean, is it the case, perhaps, that the kind of violence that women experience across a border is less contained and shaped by the sort of social relations that take people to the local police and local army, because they don't have those relationships? When they go across a border, they don't have those connections. Does that make the agency and the violence different in some way? And I just wonder whether that's something to reflect upon. The other thing I was thinking was that the stories about women that you've told us are generally pretty bleak, and that's understandable. But of course, there is a literature, not a literature necessarily that I feel very enthusiastic about, but there's quite a potent literature about how war is good for you. You know, particularly in American political science, that men who go and fight wars then come back and take on leadership positions. Work in this area of Africa by Chris Blackman and others that suggest that war's very good for you. And you come back and then you become a leader in your community. But it tends to be based upon work on men rather than women. And so I suppose my question would be do we think that work is a bit daft and, you know, and we just dismiss it? Or is there something there? And if there is something there, does it apply to women too? That's it.
Okay, so we have some very quick responses to that. Coffee is awaiting, and I don't want the whole coffee session to go.
Well, maybe I can jump in
yeah.
really quickly for the first question about cross-border violence. So the thing is more like a global approach. So yeah, it is locally displaced and the actors are there. But just as a quick example, again in Jalisco, they are recruiting people from the ex-guerrilla members from Colombia. And with new members, you can see new methods, for example, new expressions of violence, new equipment. They're building the old drones, they're building landmines, for example, and that has consequences in the conflict as well at the local level. And as I was saying at the beginning, also the weapons or the firearms are coming from the US as well. So the thing is, it is connected. And for example, in August 2024, an ex-guerrilla member was killed by the army in Pinos in Zacatecas. So this is someone from Colombia working for the cartel of Jalisco. He was a regional leader, although he was from Colombia. And the thing is, although he was eventually identified by his family, because of the lack of resources, his body was not able to be sent back to the family and to the loved ones. So you see, it's not just when they come in, instead of strategies and methodologies, it's also in terms of the consequences. So yeah, just to mention a couple of examples.
How are you?
Sure, that was an intervention.
I'm not sure either. I mean, it's a great question you posed, but I think it's also one that can sort of work its way through the day. So I don't know if we're going to get snappy answers right now. So maybe we should, unless any of you want to provide an it's all good for one. We don't have Chris Blackman in the room. Defend himself. I think I know what your answer is. Should we have coffee and we can discuss these bigger questions and return to them during the course of the day? In the meantime, thank you to our speakers for some very thoughtful and interesting presentations, including Hilina.